Hello, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar series, Perspective on Urban Flood Resilience, How Different Fields Tackle One of the World's Most Prevalent Disasters. Today, we're joined by Dr. Kristin Raub, who is not only our speaker today, but has convened this series of talks. So thank you for joining us today. This is a 6-part series, which will continue each week at this time until October 13th. This is the third talk in this series, and if you're interested in viewing previous webinars within this series, they can be found on the CUAHSI YouTube channel. Before we get started, a little introduction to CUAHSI. My name is Julia Masterman. I'm the Education and Outreach Specialist for CUAHSI. CUAHSI is a consortium of universities for the advancement of hydrologic science, and our mission is to advance water science by strengthening interdisciplinary collaboration, providing critical infrastructure through our data services, and promoting education in water science at all levels through programs like this Cyberseminar series. I would encourage you to reach out to me or visit our website, sign up for our newsletter for more information, but I'm going to give a little bit more information on CUAHSI first. We seek to achieve this mission in 2 main ways, through our community services and our data services. Our community services include things like our granted fellowships, workshops and trainings, the National Water Center Summer Institute, which is a summer research fellowship for graduate students to work on projects relating to the mission of the National Water Center. So trying to work on solving problems of national importance. We also have our Cyberseminar series like this one, the CUAHSI Virtual University and Hydrology Guest Lecture Database. Some updates on a couple of our community services. We are going to be accepting proposals for training workshops starting by the end of this week. So if there is a specialized topic or method that you'd like to share with the water science community, CUAHSI may be able to help host your workshop. Proposals will be reviewed in November. So please reach out and visit our website for more information on that. Additionally, we have a number of fellowships and grant opportunities available, and deadlines for a few of them are coming up soon. The application deadline for our Hydroinformatics Innovation Fellowship is November 19th, and the Pathfinder Graduate Fellowship deadline is December 24th. Both give funding to graduate students and early career researchers to work on projects relating to water science. More information can be found on the website. I'll post links in the chat in a moment. The other side of our house are our data services. CUAHSI hosts 2 main data repositories, one of which is HydroShare, and supports tools and resources to enable fair data practices across our community. Finally, I'd encourage you to follow us on Twitter, join our Slack channel, and sign up for our newsletter. I'll put links to those things in the chat in a moment to learn more, because it's just a very brief intro. But with that, I'm going to be passing it off to Kristin in a moment. But this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the CUAHSI YouTube channel later this afternoon. Secondly, please use the Q&A functionality to submit questions to our speaker today. And finally, we expect that everyone involved with CUAHSI Cyberseminars promote and maintain a professional, considerate, and respectful collaborative virtual environment. So thank you for being a part of that. So thank you again for joining us, and to Kristin for today's talk. Today's session is applying a flood energy water nexus approach to coastal resilience and research planning. And with that, I will pass the mic to Dr. Raub.
Thank you for that introduction, Julia. So as Julia mentioned, we're going to be taking questions in the chat, so we'll get to those at the end. So just please, as we keep going, you won't see the questions, but we'll be monitoring them on the inside. So I will share. Oops, Julia, could you unshare your screen so I could? There we go. Thank you. Oops. There we go. Is that working out okay? All All right, well, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm going to talk to you about applying a food, energy, water nexus approach to coastal resilience research and planning. So as a bit of an overview, first I'm going to talk about how I am personally conceptualizing resilience in the food, energy, water nexus, as there's a bunch of different definitions of these for lots of different research. And then I'm going to go over a pair of studies that I did recently. The first is a systematic literature review of food, energy, water nexus related coastal resilience studies. And the second is a document analysis of resilience plans. And then I'll kind of touch on how I think these all inform urban flood resilience right at the end. So to start, as I mentioned, resilience has many different definitions depending on the field using it, the community in which it's being applied, the specific conditions. So the definition that I tend to come back to and that I think really underpins all of the research I'm going to talk about in this talk is resilience is a matter of vulnerability identification and subsequent planning to build capacity to respond to and recover from predicted threats. And additionally, the food, energy, water nexus can look different as it's applied to many different fields as well. But personally, when I think of the food, energy, water nexus, especially in the context of coastal resilience, I think of this photo of New York City during Hurricane Sandy. So as we can see, a coastal hazard came in and had a very negative impact on the energy system, causing a widespread blackout. But additionally, there were reports of how this lack of energy also hindered access to food and water. So without energy, a lot of people couldn't pump water and get drinking water into their apartments, or without energy, also there was no refrigeration, causing a lot of food to spoil or hindering ability to prepare food. So sort of when I think about the food, energy, water nexus in my work, I'm thinking about how do these disasters come in and impact the systems on which humans rely, and additionally, how each of these systems are very interdependent and related to one another. So really when I'm thinking of my work, I think of a Venn diagram. I think of the existing body of work on the food, energy, water nexus or broader nexus approaches, which really just means you go into whatever you happen to be researching and intentionally seek out to investigate how food, energy, water, and all other systems are interconnected. And then the existing body of work on coastal resilience. And I am looking at how these two intersect. And that's really what this talk will be about today as well. So the motivation for primarily these two studies and really the broader of my work is that the intersection between these two fields has not really yet been well explored, or at least not formally explored. So to do so, I conducted this first study entitled Exploring the Food, Energy, Water Nexus Approach to Enhance Coastal Resilience Research and Planning. And this work was recently published in Global Sustainability. So if you're at all interested to read further, I urge you to check that out. And what I want to say up front is this study is really, to me, is a first step. It's because I hadn't seen a lot of formal studies exploring how these two fields were conducted. I wanted to step back and assess what has been done so that future research can be done from the study. So here, the driving question was, how has the food, energy, water nexus been integrated into coastal resilience? And to investigate this, I conducted a systematic literature review using Web of Science. So in Web of Science, I did a 3-stage search. The first was an initial search, then there was a title and abstract search, followed by a full text search. So using some Boolean search terms in the advanced search portal, I came up with 205 studies originally. I then reviewed the title and abstracts of all 205 studies using some search criteria I'll go over next to come up with 54 studies. And then the full text of these 54 studies were reviewed using more stringent criteria to produce the 20 studies that are used for the rest of this analysis. So as I mentioned, the title and abstract and full text search criteria are related. The only difference is that the full text criteria are much more strict than the title and abstract criteria. And that is because with title and abstracts, we wanted to leave the possibility that just because I didn't mention it in an abstract doesn't mean it wouldn't potentially be elaborated on in the full text. So in the end, the 20 studies all met the following criteria. First, they all had to include food, energy, and water systems, and it had to be more than just a buzzword or a one-off mention within the text. They had to include the connections or interconnections between the systems, also as more than a mention or a one-off. And then they had to be of coastal communities or systems. So riverine communities or systems, river basins, coastal communities or regions, or coastal countries. And then later on, we refined it to be that if it was a riverine location, it also must include some sort of like a coastal hazard, such as a flood event. And then finally, resilience was brought in to mean any management or decision-making related to human populations or the systems upon which humans rely. So all of the studies that we will talk about going forward met each of these criteria. So then with the results, we had some broad categories in terms of hazards and locations, how they conceptualize the food, energy, water nexus, a suite of studies that particularly looked at acute events in urban areas, and then the other systems that were included. So of these 20 studies, the locations that they considered were predominantly urban, and the hazards were mostly acute. So of the 20 studies, 13 were of urban locations, such as cities. And oftentimes, actually, many of these studies were of US locations, such as, New York City, Boulder, Colorado, Fort Lauderdale, Florida. 3 studies looked at purely rural locations, and then 4 we considered both. So for example, 1 study looked at the entire island of Puerto Rico, which includes both urban areas and also rural areas as well. And then of the hazards, of the 20 studies, 3 looked at what we call an other, so coastal resource use, heavy metal pollution of food supplies. 3 looked at chronic hazards, such as climate change, but then 14, which is most of the studies, 14 of 20, looked at acute hazards, which were hurricanes, flood events, and in one case, a man-made socio-technical disaster. So again, in this talk of urban flood resilience, most of these studies are of urban acute hazards. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the food, energy, water nexus can be conceptualized in many different ways. So in these 20 studies, predominantly the food system was in terms of grocery stores, the energy system was in terms of the electric grid and utilities, and the water system was in terms of water treatment facilities. And then the nexus between these 3 was really underpinned by energy. So it was the energy and water needed to operate grocery stores, and then the energy needed to operate water treatment facilities. And this is also predominantly because we were looking at urban areas and cities. So it makes sense that this is the most common conceptualization of the nexus that we saw. But as I said, this wasn't the only way the nexus was considered. So a few outlier examples is, I mentioned the man-made socio-technical disaster, and this was a study of the Persian Gulf with a nuclear power plant. So the crux of this study was, in the event of a nuclear disaster, what would happen to the seafood resources of the nearby water supply, and also the water for seawater desalination that they rely on. And then an additional conceptualization was in the case of a hydropower dam. So this was a very water-centric focus of the nexus. So this was water that could either be used for energy production through the hydropower dam or water for agricultural irrigation for the food system. So water was really the trade-off between the 2. What I think is interesting to note is that many of these studies highlighted benefits to using a nexus approach when they were studying these coastal systems. The first was that it allowed the authors to consider connections between not only the systems themselves, but between human life and the environment. Because obviously, as we know, each food, energy, and water systems all are heavily reliant on the environment. But they also said that it allowed them to consider diverse perspectives and the trade-offs that may have been overlooked. So when you go in using a nexus approach, you are intentionally seeking different systems perspectives. So in terms of resilience, some of the studies use more qualitative techniques. So this would be what kind of stakeholders are you bringing to the table? Maybe you're intentionally bringing in an energy utility, et cetera, so that you may have otherwise overlooked. Additionally, trade-offs, if you're looking purely from a water systems perspective, maybe you would naturally think to include the food system in terms of, agricultural irrigation, but potentially you may not have naturally thought to include a utility. So purposely using these techniques can help you consider a more holistic perspective of a system. And then what I thought was interesting, which I'll just touch on, is several of the studies really looked at specific technological innovations to combining these systems. So with urban systems, often resources are not produced completely within an area. Urban cities, et cetera, rely on neighboring or outlying areas. So 3 techniques to kind of capitalize on the synergies between these 3 systems were a multi-generation machine, floating production, and infrastructure ecology, which is really looking to kind of correlate these systems to less rely on outside resource use. So we can go over any of those I'm happy to talk about any of those later, but we'll just move on from those for now. So most of the studies, as I mentioned, focused on acute events in urban areas, but transportation and energy were really emphasized in these events. And particularly to note is that the energy system and the transportation system were shown to negatively impact every other system which relied on them if they were damaged. And most notably, a lot of these studies highlighted the connection between transportation and food. And transportation is commonly in terms of roads and road networks, and grocery stores often rely on supply chains for their supplies. So during, for example, like a flood event, there could be debris or physical destruction of a roadway, making it impassable. So how would a grocery store have resupply? Or if that grocery store was destroyed, how does new food get into the area? So I thought the link between transportation and food was important to highlight. Now, just because we were looking for a food, energy, water nexus approach, there were also many other systems identified within these studies that were connected to these three. And the three most common in these studies were transportation, health, and communication. So transportation was often in terms of road networks and roads. So either, physically moving supplies from one area to another, such as with grocery stores, but also access to damaged areas. So like a down power line, could you access it to fix it post-event? Health was in terms of sometimes physical hospitals, so access and healthcare, but also in terms of water and foodborne illness. So after an event, if you had a disruption to your water treatment plant or lack of refrigeration, there's sometimes illness associated with that. And then with a communication system, this is in terms of internet, telephone, physical abilities to communicate, which is obviously heavily reliant on the energy system as well. So we're just going to touch on this figure, but this is a visualization of the connections referenced within these studies between the 6 systems. But the 2 I want to highlight is that energy will negatively impact or has a connection to every other system here, as does transportation. And I should note the direction of the line indicates the direction of the impact. So for example, the line between energy and water indicates that damage to energy would have some sort of an impact on the water system. And then the weight of the line indicates the number of studies that reference such a connection. So both energy and transportation impact every other system, but health is impacted by every other system. So again, if we would like to come back to this later, or this is in that publication, if you would like to spend more time with it, but we're going to move on from this for the sake of time for now. So the main conclusions from this study were, 1, that the food, energy, water nexus approach was most commonly applied to coastal resilience in the study of urban, often US locations, and in the context of acute hazards. 2, applying a nexus approach within the context of coastal resilience is relatively new phenomena. What I didn't mention before is that of these 20 studies, the oldest one was published only in 2016. So this doesn't mean that these concepts were never connected in the past, but at least in a formalized manner, it's only since 2016, which to me is almost kind of exciting because it means that there is still plenty of room for future research in this area. 3, across the 20 studies, the energy system was shown to impact every system to which it was connected, which if we're, especially in this talk about urban flood resilience, if we're thinking about an urban system, if you were going to apply a food, energy, water nexus perspective to what you were studying, you might want to centrally consider how energy would impact every other system to which it was connected in that study. 4, the transportation system was also shown to impact every system it was connected to, which suggests that the food, energy, water nexus should be used as a starting framework and expanded to include the transportation system at a minimum. So to me, this is suggesting that maybe instead of starting with a food, energy, water approach, you start with a food, energy, water transportation approach, but then you adapt that to include whatever other system makes sense for your research study. And then 5, although these studies were in the context of academic research, I believe that there are several results that could inform resilience planning. And the 2 I would highlight are in terms of stakeholder engagement and then the sectors that are emphasized. So oftentimes with resilience planning, you'll start with a needs assessment, a lot of stakeholder outreach. It's not, resilience planning isn't usually done by one singular person. So by applying a nexus approach to planning, it could inform who you're bringing to the table. Are you having an energy utility, somebody from the local grocery store, food, organizations available at these meetings? And then which sectors you're emphasizing. So if you are in an urban area, maybe you're intentionally thinking about how the energy system may impact all of these other systems in which you're putting into your resilience plan. Maybe you're intentionally thinking about the transportation systems linked to food, et cetera. So anyway, there are many things that I think could inform, but I think at a base, this could potentially shed some areas for future research. So the next step, particular to this study, is that this study only looked at academic research. So to me, the next step was to examine if and how a food, energy, water nexus approach had been applied outside of academia, because resilience obviously is applied outside of academia oftentimes. So for example, looking at gray literature. So this is exactly what sets up this next study. So my second study is an analysis of resilience planning at the nexus of food, energy, water, and transportation systems in coastal US cities. And this work was also recently published and is available in Sustainability. Again, if anybody would like to go and read this further. So here, building from the first study, instead of just looking at a food, energy, water nexus, I intentionally sought out a food, energy, water, transportation nexus. And then instead of broadly looking at coastal resilience, this work is specifically looking at coastal resilience plans. So again, that's sort of a Venn diagram of those two concepts. And here with the resilience plans, we are specifically looking at plans that were written through the 100 Resilient Cities program. And this is a program through the Rockefeller Foundation that provided, or that competitively selected 100 cities from across the globe and provided them funding to hire a chief resilience officer and to write a resilience plan. This program actually no longer exists and is now the Resilient Cities Network, and they no longer provide funding, but they do offer a network of resources for interested communities. So the objectives here were to, one, explore the extent to which communities have considered the food, energy, water, transportation nexus in the context of coastal resilience planning. And then two, in general, understand which systems and interconnections were the most emphasized in the context of coastal resilience planning. So in layman's terms, we just wanted to know if the resilience plans considered a food, energy, water nexus approach at all, and if they didn't, what were they considering? So the method we used here was a document analysis of resilience plans. So in the end, we had 11 cities across the US that we used the resilience plans of, which are highlighted in these blue dots. And these were selected based on the following criteria. So first, they had to have been a part of the 100 Resilient Cities program. Two, they were US cities. Three, any part of their jurisdiction touched a coast or touched an ocean or gulf, so coastal. And then three, they had to have a publicly available resilience plan at the time of the analysis, because even today, some of the cities that were selected and may have met the criteria still have not released their resilience plans. So in the end, again, there were 11 cities that we chose, which are indicated by the blue dots on this map. So then when we're talking about what we coded in these resilience plans, what we ended up coding was not the entire multi-100-page document. We were coding the resilience building actions that were detailed by each plan within their, by each city within their plan. So this is an example of the Honolulu resilience plan. And with these actions, they usually started with some sort of high-level visioning. So for example, here, vision one, remaining rooted, ensuring an affordable future. Within this vision, they had a series of more specific goals. So here it would be supporting affordable housing. And then within each goal, they had the most specific actions detailed about what they would physically do to build resilience. So it is these actions that we are coding, and this is the material that is used in the document analysis. And then each city did not look the same in terms of structure, but oftentimes, again, you would have these high-level visions, these more specific goals, and then it is the actions, the most specific description of what they are doing to build resilience, and that material is what was coded. So this is an example of the Miami resilience plan. So the material in the green, this is what an action would look like within these resilience plans. So this is just something that the Miami plan had annotated. So the kind of material is a physical description of what the plan, of what the action is, the title, what objective it falls under, how this will help us, which is usually like a co-benefit kind of thing, performance metrics, key collaborators, et cetera. So this is the physical material that was being coded for the rest of this analysis, which would look different per plan, but this is a fairly standard example of the kinds of information available. So within these actions, we were coding to identify which different systems and themes each city targeted. So we obviously started with food, energy, water, and transportation, but then over the course of the analysis, we added additional themes. So we were also coding for health, communications, housing, economy, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, and environment. And then additionally, we were looking at sort of if they were referencing other planning efforts the city had engaged in, and then some broader nexus considerations, which I will talk about later. So here, the main results were, to start, across these 11 plans, there were 593 total actions, and they were not the same number across plans. So for example, Boston only had 23 actions, whereas New York City had the most with 101 actions. So across those 11 cities, what we were talking about now is the 593 actions that were written as part of these plans. And then I'm going to use the terms primary and partial focus to describe how each of those themes were incorporated within these actions. So for example, on the left from the LA plan, food was the primary focus of the city will work with the Los Angeles Food Policy Council to identify opportunities to increase the resilience of the city's food network for all communities. So their food was very centrally the focus. We called that a primary focus of that action. Whereas food was a partial focus of Honolulu's action. Resilience hubs should be defined by each neighborhood or local community for their own needs and goals. However, many are focused on providing the following during a disaster: emergency shelter, a central community gathering site, renewable energy and food storage, water and food stores, and medical supplies. So food was not centrally important to that action. It was what we would call a partial focus. So we're going to use the terms primary and partial focus moving forward. So to me, maybe not the most, but one of the most interesting things found was we intentionally sought out these 11 cities because they were coastal. But what we found was that the coastal aspects of these plans really were not emphasized. So while all of them mentioned hurricanes, floods, tsunamis, sort of these coastal hazards they would face in the introductory material, and maybe referenced other plans that they had relating to the coast, only 100 actions of those 593 related to the coast at all, so had a primary or partial focus. But only 58 of those 100 had a primary focus on the coast. So only 10% of the actions really strongly considered the coastal environment, which to me going in, that was not what I was expecting. So sort of a surprising result to me. And then this is just a simple bar chart showing the number of primary focus actions that focused on each of these themes that we targeted. So obviously we went in intentionally seeking food, energy, water, and transportation. So the first thing I noticed is that number one, they were not evenly considered. So food had the very least primary focus actions out of any of the systems that we looked at, with only 12, and so up to transportation here in this case, which had 52. But overall, the food, energy, water, transportation systems were not the most commonly considered systems and themes. What was the most common was housing, economy, and diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, with equity being the most common theme across all of the actions of the resilience plans. It's also important to note that in general, the systems and themes were not uniformly considered across the resilience plans as well. So for example, San Francisco's plan had no actions at all relating to food, but they had the most actions relating to housing. And then Miami's plan also had no actions related to food, but they had the most actions related to flooding. So each city tended to emphasize different systems and themes. And then the long and short answer is we went in looking to see, had a food, energy, water, transportation nexus been applied? And the short answer here is no. What we found was there were very few food, energy, water, transportation nexus related actions. So of those 593 actions, only 15 or 3% at least mentioned 3 of the 4 systems, when only 4 included all 4 food, energy, water, and transportation. And then only 8 of these 15 considered interconnections between the systems. 7 of these were in the context of a disaster. And then when the action did consider cascading impacts, which were only 6 total, the energy system was the central focus. So really, of those 593, only 15 loosely related to this nexus approach. So we weren't really seeing a lot of evidence that a direct food, energy, water, transportation nexus approach was used. But what we did see was more general nexus considerations. So what we were noticing during coding was that many plans highlighted other planning efforts, which was showing a connection between resilience planning and maybe other plans that were in a different kind of subject area. Mostly they were referencing connections to other systems as positive co-benefits. So I like how changing one system would benefit another versus a negative cascading impact. And then there was also many references to interdisciplinary efforts and interdepartmental strategies. So what we developed was what we call the Nexus Index. So it's really just a grading system. So every single action, so each of those 593 actions was assigned a point value under these 5 criteria. So the extent to which the action referenced partnerships and collaborations, if it referenced how that action connected to another plan, if it called out co-benefits of that action, if it recognized cascading impacts or sought to incorporate interdisciplinary or like cross-silo practices or principles. So each action was scored a point value between 0 and 8, and then those points were aggregated over the whole plan. So just really briefly, and there's a lot of nuance to all of these, but what we did was each city, because they had a different number of actions, they therefore had a different maximum potential score. So we created a Nexus percentage, which is just a percentage of how they did in terms of their actual versus potential Nexus score. So overall, the cities obtained 30% of their potential Nexus score, but we see Honolulu, Miami, and Oakland doing the best, with the best only being 43%, and then Norfolk and Seattle scoring the lowest. So again, if you are interested in the new and like the details of this Nexus Index approach, that is available in the study, but just for the purposes here, just know that it exists and that there is quite a range between how well the best city did and the worst city did. And I think heterogeneity is just the key thing to note. So here there were 3 broad conclusions. The first is that there was little evidence that a food, energy, water, transportation nexus approach had been used when creating the resilience plans, but that there may have been evidence, especially using the Nexus Index, that they might be open to using a nexus approach in the future, as there were principles of nexus approaches that were found in the plan, such as co-benefits instead of cascading negative impacts, or seeking collaboration and partnership versus, intentionally applying or intentionally seeking out specific stakeholders. 2, there was an inconsistent focus on proximity to the coast within the coastal cities resilience plan actions, which again was surprising because we intentionally chose these cities as they were coastal cities, but they didn't really seem to focus on the coastal environment, with only 10% of their actions focusing on it. And then 3, there were inconsistencies in how food, energy, water, transportation systems and the 11 themes were incorporated across the plans. And to me, this is just indicative of heterogeneity. Resilience will look different and be different for every community based on what they're facing. So for example, the San Francisco plan had the most actions related to housing, and obviously they have a well-documented housing crisis, whereas Miami had the most actions related to flooding, and they have a long history of flooding in their community as well. So with there, that's a really high level overview of those 2 studies. And I want to emphasize again, to me, those are first step studies. I think that is a preliminary analysis of how these 2 concepts could come together, but I do think it's really interesting. And I think there are a lot of avenues for future research. So specifically in terms of urban flood resilience, what I think these studies indicate is that if you are looking at an urban system during a flood, systems interconnections are very highlighted during hurricane and flood events. So particularly in urban areas, those systems tend to be very heavily interdependent just due to, smaller spatial area than in rural areas. So it's just a very interesting area to apply to whatever flood research you happen to be doing. I thought it was interesting that the resilience planning lacked an emphasis on the coastal environment. So I think there's a lot of areas of future research to investigate if and how applying a nexus approach could help inform resilience planning. So ours was just to look at, did it happen? And I think, could it happen is another question that could be asked. Food, energy, water nexus approach is relevant to urban resilience as acute events really highlight systems interconnections. And I think they also provide opportunities for co-benefits. And like most importantly, as I mentioned, I think that there is plenty of opportunity for future research. So while I only focused on these studies in terms of a very qualitative document analysis type perspective, many of the studies that I investigated did not use those approaches. There's many modeling and more technical aspects that I really think Nexus approaches could be applied to. So I think if it sparks anything, I'm hoping that it could maybe, I don't know, who knows what the possibility is, but I think there could be a lot of cool research questions. Personally, what I'm interested in doing next is I am very interested in interviewing those who wrote the resilience plans. So it's one thing to read a document that was, already exists, but to understand what went into the decision making, how did they make it, what challenges do they see in applying a nexus approach to these plans in the future. Additionally, it'd be important to analyze other gray literature, such as hazard mitigation plans, or even just resilience plans that were written not as part of the 100 Resilient Cities program, because there's many cities that are not a part of that program that are still engaging in resilience planning now. And then my current research, which I'm currently very interested in, is looking at the concept of resilience as transformation. So not just resilience as going back to what was, but resilience in terms of making something about the system different, and particularly how either a nexus approach has been incorporated or could be incorporated in the future. So again, this was a very high level overview. I'd be more than happy to chat or share these studies with anybody that is interested. And I love to collaborate. So I would love to hear from anybody. And this is my contact information if anybody needs it, but I would love to take your questions now.
Thank you very much, Kristin. That was great. Please enter any questions you might have via the Q&A functionality of Zoom. But we have a couple questions to get us started here. What do you feel are, I guess, the critical aspects, I guess, in the short term that merit the most research attention in terms of urban flood resilience?
I mean, not to harp on it, but I mean, to me, I think kind of systems interconnections are really interesting. It's something where, I mean, that's sort of my desire for this whole talk is just, or the series, I guess, rather, is just, I think that there's a lot of benefit to breaking out of singular systems. To me personally, resilience is it tackles wicked problems. You know, I don't think one singular field or technique is going to solve all of it. So I think what's really interesting about this line of work is that there is such potential for collaboration. And I think the most interesting, cool research coming out of it is things that, you know, combine different fields and different research. And so I think taking inspiration from a Nexus approach is, if you are doing one singular thing, kind of maybe opening that box and saying, how might what I am working on now connect to other things? Or especially in terms of human use and human communities, you know, people need a lot of different things to operate day to day. So anyway, just thinking practically, like, how would your research be used by somebody and how might it connect to other things? And I think that could open the box for a lot of really cool research down the line, which I would love to chat about if anybody would like to in the future.
Yes, thank you. So another question that you've already started to touch on, but how has interdisciplinary research methods or cross-field collaboration been relevant or important to your work? I think more so than a lot of other talks in this series, and probably more so than other talks that CUAHSI gets to hear. Your research focuses on interdisciplinary by nature. So I was wondering if you could speak more to that.
Sure. I guess to broaden it, a little backstory. So I consider myself an interdisciplinary scientist. My background actually started off in the natural sciences with marine science and in oceanography, you know, physically working in a lab. I then worked in ecosystem or environmental economics, and then transferred into my PhD, which I really just kind of hodgepodge methods together. So to me, it's very near and dear. I've always been inspired by connecting different fields or sitting in on classes where it may not be your necessary, you know, background, but it's always really inspiring. And I actually find that, like, that's where a lot of really interesting ideas from is, oh, that's a really interesting theory. I wonder how that could be applied to this research. So I think in general, I would just encourage people to, you know, let go of feeling stupid. It happens all the time when you're in an area where you're not the expert, but I find it really refreshing. I love sitting in on things that I've never done before and putting all the ideas together. And quite honestly, you meet some really interesting people and have some really cool projects come out of it. But yes, I also constantly have the issue of, please check the box of what you do. And I never actually fit into one box, because also, while these are very qualitative methods, I have a very quantitative background, which is easily applied to these methods as well. So I'm hoping it's more inspiring, and I would hope that more people kind of take the chance and blend ideas. And, you know, I think it's really cool.
Yes, I may have misspoke. I guess I meant to say that your are relatively unique among what we kind of engage with on a day-to-day. But you know, as we've seen through this series and in general, you know, water science is kind of inherently interdisciplinary.
Yes,
but it's really interesting to hear about the specific methodology that you've used to investigate these problems. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that methodology, because I think it might be unique for all. It's new to me. So if you could you speak a little bit more to kind of day-to-day functionality, how when you're coding these papers and doing this review, what does that look like?
Well, I mean, for me personally, it usually means sitting at my computer with my cat on my lap. So that's kind of a cool way to do research, I find personally. But really what it means is it's taking something that you would do normally day to day in science. Obviously, everybody does a lit review for any paper that they're writing, but it formalizes it. So often with both of these techniques, they're similar, just different bodies of work. You basically establish more or less a code book. So you go through ahead of time and you establish very rigorous criteria for what makes a study meet the criteria, what does not, trying to go through and find all those nuances. So it's kind of a very tedious process. So usually you would kind of have like a pilot pool study of papers. So both defining your search criteria and when you're developing those title and abstract and full text, or with the resilience plans, it was just physically a code book. So it's a big iterative process. And then you work with another person or a team to validate that code book. So just because what I have in my head, you need to make sure that if you hand the code book to somebody else, they would get within 90% of what you're getting. So it's not very exciting methodology, but it's also very accessible and it's very cost efficient. So especially if you are limited or a grad student or you need another chapter, I think it's a really interesting way to ask some pretty cool questions in a very accessible manner. So really all it takes is a lot of detail orientedness and an ability to make yourself sit down and read papers. And then also having somebody else to help validate that code book, because you really don't get the rigor if you're just doing it singular by yourself.
Yeah, thank you. So we have a question from the audience. Have you found any community globally that does actually fully consider the food, energy, water nexus in their development planning? Or does this intersectionality still only mostly exist in academia?
So I think that's hard to answer because I have not read every single plan everywhere yet. It's something that I would really like to investigate further, but I would maybe caveat it and say of the plans that I have looked into, both for this project and just in my own research outside, I have not yet seen a perfect example of it. Obviously, some of the actions within these resilience plans, like some of them are great. Like there's a few like really good examples of like, oh, they directly acknowledge the energy system, if impacted, will do this. So we are purposely going to look into smart gridding or something, like strategies that would, maybe increase redundancy or, take resilience principles and apply them. But I haven't really seen a formal full plan yet. And part of what I think is the challenge is, I see a lot of challenges with this, but I think one is because resilience means something different to everybody. And also like, thinking in terms of systems interconnections, it's really dependent on the person. Like it's not just going to be universally done by everybody. So it's sort of like, I'm wondering like, that's kind of what I'm wondering for the next step is like, how do you get people to start thinking about these interconnections? Like, I think like people are very obvious, like I'm from Vermont, I went to school in Vermont. So like, you see these flood events happen and people will completely acknowledge like, oh yeah, during that flood, the roads happened and then we couldn't get to the grocery store. So like they know about these interconnections between systems. So I think sometimes it's connecting the dots. Like sometimes you think resilience plan and you think one thing. And I think that's kind of why I like interdisciplinary is just finding somebody who thinks outside the box. Like, could you apply one methodology to another? So anyway, that's a little bit of a roundabout answer where I have not personally seen a perfect example. That does not mean it doesn't exist, but I think it's because there are a lot of challenges in kind of implementing some of these ideas. You're asking people doing something very complicated to kind of make it even more complicated in a way, so I have a lot of ideas. If that's anything somebody wants to chat about, I could see a lot of areas of cool research to try to start poking around in that area. But short answer is no, I don't personally have a perfect example, but I have plans that I like better than others. Like Honolulu's plan is pretty cool if you want to read that one.
Awesome. Okay, we have another audience question. Can you elaborate more on Cistern Connection? Is the idea that water systems between communities or even individual states have the ability to feed each other to meet certain demands? If so, how broad could such a system be?
So like a water system is what they're asking?
Yeah, so I guess potentially, how are these geographically connected potentially places? Could they impact one another in terms of the stresses on their water systems?
I would say yes. And that's actually, yeah, I don't want to go too big with the answer, but I think that's sort of a side study I want to do is kind of the comparison between how the food, energy, water nexus has been applied in riverine versus urban systems. or coastal systems, because a lot of the studies we found were riverine were so different. So when you're talking about like a riverine system, that's often talking about like watershed scale and like dams and hydropower, and really then you get a lot of like cross boundary challenges, like especially out in like anyway, like outside of the US oftentimes, you know. So I think like that is a huge yes. We all know water systems, watersheds, everything. Water is very politically challenging to put a boundary on. So I would say first and foremost, like if you're talking about the broader water system, yes, which oftentimes a lot of these, some of the resilience plan and some of the studies did references, they do have to pipe in water from outside areas. So it does depend on that outside area's water supply. So like physically the geographic boundary of a city, you know, you get it's blurry as well too. Like try to draw an exact line around Boston and all the different neighborhoods, and people consider them different things. And I mean, that's challenging in and of itself too. But then physically in like a city, if you're talking about just a water treatment plant, then I think those lines are a little bit clearer, you know, because obviously there's physical infrastructure and physical piping. It can only access so many houses and such, you know. So I think it's challenging. And I mean, honestly, that points at what I see as another challenge to implementing a food, energy, water nexus in resilience is it's the scale issue. It's, you know, some of these things are operated or managed, or, you know, policy happens at the national level, but then you sort of have like regional or state level policy on top of that. And then, you know, some of these things are then you go to the local level, but then there's translations between the three. And sometimes it's like politically fuzzy boundaries between, you know, who gets to control what, and does one thing impact the other thing. So it can actually get kind of challenging when you're trying to define one versus the other. So anyway, I think this whole realm is kind of like, I can see why it's been challenging to implement, which is potentially why it hasn't really been studied a whole lot, just because it's easier to take off a small little chunk and not really consider the big picture. But anyway, I feel like all I have is long answers to these. So again, I'll follow it up always with, if you'd like to chat further, I have a lot of thoughts and love to chat about this stuff. So maybe we'll leave the answer there.
Okay. What do you think are the main benefits of developing a resilience plan with the FEWT Nexus? Is there an increased urgency to include this nexus in planning due to climate change, even though most plans focus on other topics such as housing and equity?
I mean, I'm not going to say one is more important, because I think really what the issue is there are a lot of important things. So I'm not like, I very want to make that clear. It's not that they should not be focusing on equity. That's not the case. They definitely should. And that's actually a follow-up study we have about how they should even be doing it more. But what I think is that potentially there are so many important topics, it's really hard to consider them centrally. And I think what happens is they do a needs assessment, which is great. So it's really what's on the top of people's mind. But I think it's like, sometimes it's like a shortened attention span sort of thing. Like if a really bad event hits, that's like top of people's mind. They know exactly what's happening. They want to do something about it then. But if it's been a really long time since something bad has happened, it's not really top of people's mind. So in terms of priority, I think that's maybe why, these are all hypotheses, you know, maybe why some of these aren't happening. But to me personally, I think it's really important to consider these interconnections, because I think traditionally resilience happens per sector. There's resilience of the energy system, resilience of the food system, resilience of the water system. And that's really typically how you see these things talked about. But if you look at any big storm that's happened, and I mean, like, pick any of the tons that have happened recently, you know, you always hear about, you know, well, the energy system went down and now we can't have any food. And now the water system is all, you know, it's just like they all are really heavily interdependent. Or, you know, you don't realize that there really is only one main roadway in and out of the city or town or whatever. And if it goes down, you know, transportation also impacts nearly everything else. So to me, it's like, if you're going to apply resilience principles and go as bases like, you know, the 4 R's with redundancy and, you know, all of these things, I just think that, to me, I see these issues not just in newspapers, you know, like not even formally, you know, there are a lot of formal studies as well, but they just come up over and over and over again. And I think that it would be very interesting to try to purposely put in like a pre-planning kind of thing. Like there's a very limited capacity when disaster hits to actually implement anything. So like, could you put these thoughts into a pre-plan so that when it happens, you have the ability to add an access road, you know, a second road that's a bit redundant, or could you use that as an opportunity to implement some smart gridding so that only little pieces of your energy grid go down versus the whole big one, you know, like, I don't know. Anyway, I just think that there's a lot of cool opportunity. And I think it could potentially, in the vein of not going back to what was and making the impacts less severe next time, I think there's a lot of interesting opportunities that could be investigated, and especially thinking through a nexus lens.
Yeah, that's a great response. I think, I guess, follow up to that question, do you see there being increased urgency to create plans like this in light of climate change? Or I guess in your research so far, what role does climate change play in terms of these plans?
I mean, I see climate as the basis of most of these plans. I would like to think that it's becoming more popular. Like I've seen more like RFPs and grants come out to try to promote resilience planning. But I mean, with climate change, it underpins everything. You know, it's increased in frequency and severity of storm events. It's causing more variability and drought impacts. You know, it's all these things in which humans need to rely. And to me, resilience is also about disturbance events. You know, like that's kind of what really is setting off a test of resilience, or kind of assessing where in the resilience spectrum you land. So like climate change is only going to increase these disturbances, which is sort of going to test communities more and more. So it's sort of, that's why I see a great need for all of these things. Is like, as we can all see, it's just, there's, you know, we just had Ida again, you know, like there's hurricanes all the time. Flooding is one of the most prevalent, you know, disasters happening all over the place. You know, it just, droughts are happening in conjunction with all of these things too, you know? So I think it's just, we have to think about, these things are not going to stop. They're just going to keep going. Obviously communities are getting hit, you know? So I think it's just, it's really time to start thinking about these things ahead of time. And I think planning is an essential piece of this, because it is how you're deciding how you're going to deal with these things. Because oftentimes change doesn't really occur until it has to. And I think there's lots of has to opportunities in the future.
Yeah, well said. One more question. Though you stated that this is just the beginning for this type of research, are there any common pitfalls you've noticed among the many resilience plans you've studied in regard to the flood energy water nexus? Or do you have any recommendations that you would make to enhance this aspect now while the research is still ongoing?
That's a complicated one. Because I have my own personal opinions about the plans. Like I have plans. I mean, I also don't know how many other people have actually sat down and read these resilience plans cover to cover, like I have. But there's a vibe that, without naming cities, that certain cities really seem to take it super seriously, and other cities were like very cursory. Like honestly, one of the questions that I have is, I don't know who some of these resilience plans were written for, which isn't saying, I guess that's sort of like another roundabout answer, but I think that is one of the big questions in terms of how good is a resilience plan. Like I actually also would really love to know, did anything actually happen once these plans were written? You know, like kind of like a follow-up study of like, did anything change, or how are you measuring resilience? Is anything actually different now that you have planned? Because some of the actions within them, I was surprised that they existed. Like, I guess just to call it an example, the Seattle Resilience Plan had an action to increase the number of sports fans that they had, with the premise of like boosting the economy and everything. But to me, just as coming from my perspective of, you know, I shared that picture of New York City in the beginning, you know, like I'm all about, oh, disaster and what happens. And that was like, kind of like, you know, you try to acknowledge your own bias going in. That was kind of what I was expecting to find in these cities. And then to have an action about sports fans, I was a little bit surprised. So to me, I am very curious as to how certain cities chose to prioritize what they did. Like there was a huge economic like bend to a lot of these plans, which is obviously very important, but it was sort of the lack of acknowledgement of how those might be connected to broader things. You know, like I think to me, it's all about interconnections. It's yes, your economy, but your economy is also influenced by disasters and, you know, your health of your workforce, and, you know, which is all impacted by climate change. So to me, it's like everything's a spider web, everything's all connected. And it's sort of like the siloed manner in which a lot of these actions were written, that was a little bit surprising. And I do think that there is area for improvement. Like, I think it's great that people are thinking about this and writing plans, but some of the plans were very surprising just in terms of they did not seem very actionable. And I really couldn't tell if it was like some of them were literally like their actions were a 3-sentence description where it was like, is this material somewhere else? Or is it, this is really all you're doing to think about this problem? So that was surprising to me. Yeah. So anyway, I would hope that there is opportunity in the future for people to take it a little bit more seriously and like really think about, if something happens tomorrow, what would you physically go do, you know, and to have that level of detail. Cause I think that's kind of what's needed if anything's going to change.
Yeah. I guess one last question following up on that. You mentioned that a next step might be looking at kind of the hazard response plans or the disaster response plans that either, you know, cities or other groups might have. what do you expect? Do you have any hunches, or what would you expect to see as something that might differ between these resilience plans and those hazard response plans in this context?
Yeah, so I think my short answer, so obviously, like, I was surprised going in to find what was in a resilience plan. So at this point, like, I don't really have expectations just from a realistic perspective, but from what we saw in the systematic literature review study, disaster and what we call like acute events, like something that's like really shocking and abrupt, that's really when you highlight those interconnections between systems. So because those plans are specifically focusing on a disaster, my hope would be that there would be more of an acknowledgement or something, like, because I guess I will also caveat that I didn't bring up, to me, there is the explicit use of a nexus approach, meaning you intentionally go in saying, I'm going to look at systems interconnections, this is how I'm going to do it. Or there's like a, not a by accident, but we just so happened to find interconnections. And that was really like a split of the study. Some of them were using a nexus approach, this is intentional, whereas other ones we're looking at a post-disaster hurricane, oh, look, we happen to find that these systems were interconnected. So whether or not it's explicit or implicit, I guess, like, I would hope that there would be more connections, because those acute events, especially in, if you're looking at urban areas, those really, really highlight those interconnections. It's really hard to ignore the fact that if your energy system goes down, that's not the only thing it impacts ever, you know? So that would be my hope. But again, that's a study that I would really love to have done, or if somebody already has data or something, that I think that would be very interesting to go in and see, you know, if it's not in resilience planning, is it in another type of plan? And if it's not in resilience planning, I mean, is there a way to find those plans, or, you know, apply elements of both or something?
Yeah, that's great. Okay, to wrap us up here, the final, I guess, question. Do you have any calls to action that you'd like to highlight, either for the scientific community, policy, or practitioner community?
Yeah, I guess I would go maybe like a base level call to action is just, from my own career, I have really benefited from not just staying within one field. You know, like, I had to go and get a certificate of complex systems. I had never been introduced to complex systems. I had no, like, I was part of my grant program in college but because of that, there's so many principles of that underlie resilience, and I had no idea. And there's a lot of principles that I pull from that I apply to my work now, and I never would have done it, basically because I didn't have a computer science background and it was very intimidating to do. But like, I would really urge people to go out, do not be afraid to feel stupid. I think that's actually a real strength, you know, like, go out and try something new, sit on different seminars, try a new skill. There's plenty of little short courses. CUAHSI has plenty of them as well. Lots of past Cyberseminar series, but just try something new. Like, it's just, I have really, really benefited from ideas that come from outside my own field. I don't know if I even have a field anymore, but like, I really love blending ideas, and I've seen a lot of people say the same thing. So I would really strongly urge people to consider either use a nexus approach in your work that can be adapted in a lot of different ways, but just think outside the box, bring in another collaborator. If you don't have the expertise, probably somebody else does. And those collaborations can both be really like invigorating and exciting, because you're both excited about a project, and also you can learn a lot too. So that would be my call to action to everyone, is just go try something new academically. It's pretty cool.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think with that, we should wrap it up here. We're getting close to the top of the hour. So once again, thank you so much, Kristin, for the talk today, the conversation, and for, you know, convening this series. We are now halfway through this Cyberseminar series. If this one is recorded and will be posted along with the previous